So this exhibit, the conspiracy trial exhibit of the conspiracy trial of 1969 and 1970, my mom was a sequestered juror for 5 months, and she was instrumental in getting the charges overturned. And therefore, I curated this exhibit. The start of it, this is the beginning of it. This is all about the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, which was the catalyst for the trial. And what this shows here, it's all the groups that were involved, the anti-war protesters, the yippies, the MOB, the Students for Democratic Society, the Black Panthers, the SNCC, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference were all of the various groups that were involved. As a result, because Daley would not give them permits to stay in the park purposefully, at 11 o'clock at night, the police would march into the park, and there were thousands of people in the park, and violence would ensue. And so this went on for 4 days, and as a result of that, 8 people were indicted on one charge, on charges of conspiracy, and also charges of crossing state lines to incite a riot, which was the reason that crossing state lines to incite a riot. The reason that was instituted, that was at the end of the Johnson administration, beginning of the Nixon administration. That was a bill that they passed in Congress, basically to squash the Black Power movement, and then it was also used to squash the anti-war movement. The conspiracy charge itself was ludicrous because of these 8 men that were indicted. Some of them never even knew each other. So, but this was all about our government. Richard Nixon, John Mitchell, who was his Attorney General, basically trying to squash the Black Power and the anti-war movement, and this is why they were indicted, and therefore that leads to the trial, which was a year later. So as you go in this way to see the beginning of the exhibit, this is a timeline of the Chicago conspiracy trial itself. It gives you an idea of the time frame and how long it took. September 68 was when they impaneled the grand jury. And the trial itself didn't start until September of 1969, and was over at the end of February 1970. So this gives you an idea of, this tells you who the people were indicted, what the whole time frame of how long it took for them eventually to be charged at the end of the trial. Now this is a timeline, excuse me, of events before and during the trial, which is important. Well, this is all what led up to the trial. The various groups, the yippies and the anti-war groups, going to Mayor Daley to get the permits to stay in the park. They started applying for these permits, 6, 7, 8 months, sometimes a year in advance before they were going to have the convention. And what they wanted to do, basically, they were calling this it was the Chicago Convention, and they were an alternative to the convention, and what they were calling the Festival of Life, as opposed to the Convention of Death, was their whole idea about having artists and poets and musicians and everything come into Lincoln Park as a counter to the Democratic Convention, because they were very unhappy with the fact that Hubert Humphrey was the nominee. They didn't want him as the nominee, and so what led to that. So then eventually, as I said before, they were indicted. And then during the trial, there was a lot of really important events that happened during the trial, which the jury did not understand because they were sequestered. They had no idea what was going on, all the protests, all of the anti-war movement, everything that was happening during the trial. Probably one of the biggest events was in December of 1969, is when the FBI and the Chicago police murdered Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in their beds. All of these extremely important events were happening, and the jury had no idea it was happening. So this is the beginning of the trial. This was like a history-making trial. And one of the important parts of this exhibit is my mother, although she was sequestered for 5 months, she kept a journal. So her journal is the thread throughout this entire exhibit. The things that she had to say, how she felt about what was going on. It was really important because it was a woman that was just thrown into this situation. Even though my mom grew up in Chicago, she had been living in Des Plaines for 30 years by the time she was called to be a juror. She was 51 years old at the time, And she had not been exposed to the counterculture or anti-war movements or anything. And the fact that she was called into this to be a juror in this trial was pretty amazing for her, and it really changed her life. So having said that, these were the defendants that were indicted. Rennie Davis, who was part of the MOB, the movement to end the war in Vietnam. David Dellinger, also the national MOB with Rennie Davis. John Fritz and Lee Weiner were just professors, and it was never really quite understood why they were ever included in this indictment. Tom Hayden was one of the founders of the SDS, Students for the Democratic Society. Bobby Seale was a founder of the Black Panther Party, and Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin were the founders of the Yippie Party. So this disparate group all came together and was all indicted. As I said before, with the conspiracy, most of these people hadn't even met each other, and as Abby Hoffman famously said, conspiracy, he said, we can't even agree on lunch. So the whole conspiracy theory was rather silly to begin with. Now these were the lawyers. William Kunstler and Leonard Weinglass were the defense attorneys. William Kunstler, as a result of this trial, became very radicalized as well, and became an anti-establishment lawyer after this trial was over. Leonard Weinglass became quite radicalized after this trial. The judge was Julius Hoffman, who was, the way I feel, was put there by the Nixon administration. He was a totally partial judge who hated these defendants from the beginning and never changed his mind. And the two prosecuting attorneys were Thomas Fran and Richard Schultz. Thomas Fran was also a man that just hated these defendants from the beginning. The whole trial just became, it was so unfair and so partial and so political that, they were never going to get a fair trial to begin with, so they kind of turned it into like a circus. So as I said, this was my mom, kind of what she looked like at the time. This was her actual summons to jury duty. She never threw anything away. And one of the reasons why we kept everything for her, because she was sequestered and she wanted to read everything when she finally got off the trial. And this is a picture of the jury itself. That's my mom. And the jury was composed of 10 women and 2 men. Not one of them had a college education. That was rather planned for by the government. And it was, as the trial progressed, it was 4 women that wanted them innocent on all counts, my mother included, and the other 8 wanted them guilty on all counts. And so, this is just some graphics. This was finally at the end of the trial. Several months later, my mother gave an interview, and this is a graphic from that interview. But, as my mom said here too, this is a piece from her journal. She said, as I sit in my jury box, I wonder what the defendants are thinking. Here are 14 people, well, two were alternates, who as a whole have not had one half the education as any one of the 7. Well, it became 7, the 8 became 7. There should be a better way of choosing a jury. How can 14 people like this even begin to understand what the defendants are without knowing so much more about their backgrounds? The longer I sit here, the more I feel that we are not the ones to judge them. And, my mom she kept coming back to that all the time. But as the trial progressed and months later, it turned out that they were very lucky that she was one of the ones that was sitting in judgment. But we'll get into that as we go further. So these were the witnesses that were called to the stand, just some of them, the prosecution and the defense. There were 53 prosecution witnesses and 113 defense witnesses called. And one thing my mother talks about in her journal quite frequently as well, the defense, all the witnesses for the prosecution, almost to a 1, were all undercover FBI and undercover Chicago police. And and my mother even said in her journal, she was so upset about that. She said, how can these people live with themselves? They befriended like some of the defendants like a year before the trial, or a year even before the convention began. And in one instance, and I don't remember the man's name, he was one of the undercover witnesses who was posing as Abby Hoffman's bodyguard. And until the day he testified on the stand, Abby Hoffman did not know that he was an undercover cop. And so therefore that was basically their only strategy was these undercover witnesses that were speaking against the 8 that became 7. And I mean, so it really wasn't much of a case, as my mother even said in her journal too. She said, that's so scary. She said, Margie could have a roommate in college, it could be an undercover witness. She said, how would we not know? And that really did bother her. She was really, and that's also when she said, this is the first time in my life I'm afraid of my government. And she said, I don't like the feeling. And so then when they got to the defense witnesses, there was 113 called, and by that time they had turned the trial into like this very theatrical circus-like atmosphere, because that's the way the defendants felt. That's the only way they could get their point across, because of the unconstitutionality of the trial itself. So all of the witnesses, all the witnesses they called, they were all celebrities. They were musicians, writers, authors, movie celebrities, directors, and I mean, it was like a who's who of celebrities that testified, and along also with journalists and a lot of other people as well. But the sensationalism was because of the celebrities. And one of the really most fun things, they called Allen Ginsberg, who was a beat poet and who was an anti-war activist. And he meditated, and he would try to teach people meditation. This funny graphic is about him meditating, and he actually meditated on the stand during the trial. And my mom, it was really funny. Most all the people just really disliked him intensely. And she said about Allen Ginsberg, she said, I know quite a few of the jurors were horrified. She said, but I liked him. She said, after Allen Ginsberg testimony at the Palmer House, that's where they were sequestered, we sat on the floor and tried to imitate the and meditate. And I always think that's so funny. I could just see my mom sitting on the floor meditating. I just think that's so funny. But so I mean, the trial, as unconstitutional and sad as it was, there were a lot of funny parts to it as well. But it was very difficult, a difficult time in this country because we were so divided. And then as it goes on, this kind of goes in. One thing I need to discuss is about Bobby Seale. Bobby Seale was of the 8 that then became the 7. And his lawyer, Charles Geary, who was an anti-establishment lawyer at the time, was ill, was in the hospital, and could not come to defend Bobby Seale. So Bobby Seale wanted to defend himself, which is our constitutional right. Judge Hoffman refused to allow him to defend himself. And he kept telling him, you have defense, you have Kunstler and Weinglass, but Kunstler and Weinglass were not his attorneys, and he wanted to defend himself, and Hoffman kept denying him that constitutional right. So he started disrupting the courtroom. He would disrupt, he would scream, he would raise his voice, he would create disturbance, and because he just wanted the right to defend himself. And Judge Hoffman eventually, after a couple of days of this, rather than, he declared a mistrial, which is what he should have done to begin with because he didn't have a lawyer, or giving him the right to defend himself. Instead, he bound and gagged him. And he put him in a chair and bound and gagged him. He was gagged so tight, his hands, he was bound so tight that he couldn't, it was really painful. He could hardly breathe. And my mother, that upset her incredibly. She was crying in the courtroom. She said, she just could not believe that something like this was happening in our country. And, she was just dumbfounded by it. And she speaks a lot of this here in her journal. So eventually, after about 3 days of this, Hoffman finally declared a mistrial, and Bobby Seale was taken off the trial, and so those Chicago 8 became the Chicago 7. And what this kind of goes through too, what an ordeal it was for the family, and especially my father, to have my mother sequestered for 5 months. The first month, as I said, she was in the Palmer House. The first month, we weren't even allowed to see her. Our phone calls were monitored, our mail was opened, and the first time we saw her, it was once a week. You're allowed to go down there for like 4 hours in a big room with all the rest of the jury and marshals everywhere. You could never have any moment. You couldn't have any time to yourself. We couldn't even speak to each other alone for 5 months. And this, mind you, happened all during the holidays. The trial started on September 24th, so it went over Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's. Ended up, the trial was over after Valentine's Day. which is a 50th anniversary this year of the end of the trial. And I mean, this affected my dad. My mom worked, my dad owned an automobile parts store, a Western Auto store, or a Western Tire store. My mom worked with him in the business, and it was a real ordeal for them to be apart. I was in college at the time, so it wasn't that difficult for me. I could come down and watch the trial because my mom was on the jury, which to me was fascinating. I was excited about it. I mean, I thought it was a really fun, interesting thing. And so, I mean, all of this, it was like she was separated. The first time she was allowed to come home was Christmas Day, and they allowed her she came home with a marshal, and he brought her home at 9:30 in the morning and made her leave at 1:30 in the afternoon, which was just unbelievably cruel. And she went back, and because most of all the other jurors, they didn't come back till much later in the day. Why he forced her to come back, I don't know. She went back and wrote in her journal. She went back, she started to cry. She sat in her hotel room by herself and started to cry. And then after that, they were allowed to come home every Sunday for 4 hours with a marshal. And one instance that I'd like to tell people is one weekend I was home and she came home with the marshal. Now mind you, she and my dad hadn't been together since September, and this is January by this time. And they went upstairs in their bedroom to be alone for a while and to talk to each other, just to have some privacy. And this marshal after about 10 minutes, he went to the bottom of the stairs and started hollering at them, telling them to come downstairs. I mean, it was just ludicrous. And I looked at him, I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Leave them alone. They haven't been alone since September. They have every right to have some privacy." Or they could be talking about the trial, they said. I said, "You know what? I think that's the furthest thing from their mind right now." This guy this is the type of thing, this is how we lived. And then during the trial, after the prosecution had presented their case, it was halfway through, this was right before Christmas. Rennie Davis, who was one of the defendants, came up to Northern, where I went to college, and gave a speech. And so I went to hear the speech, of course, and I, very stupidly, after it was over, I raised my hand. I wanted to ask him a question, and I stupidly said my mother was on the jury. And I never should have said that. I mean, I was a 20-year-old naive kid, right? And everybody turned around and stared at me, and I got so nervous that whatever question I was going to ask, I kind of bumbled it out, and it made it sound like I had talked to my mother about this, which was virtually impossible. We couldn't. Every time I spoke with her, there was a marshal on the other end of the line. There was no way, even if we had tried, we couldn't talk about the trial. Well, as a result of this, I knew what I had done. The minute it happened, I knew what I had done. And when I got back to the dorm that night, I called her, and I said, "Mom, I have something to tell you." I said, "But it's none of the marshal's business. I need to speak to you privately." And I said to the marshal, I said, "Get off the phone and let me talk to my mother." And he refused to get off the phone. So I said, "Well, Mom, I can't tell you." I said, "I did something stupid tonight." I said, "But I can't tell you what it is." Well, lo and behold, as a result of that, they had pegged my mother a sympathetic juror by that time. They had even pegged her a sympathetic juror because when she was called to be questioned, she was reading a book by James Baldwin, which was kind of unusual for a 51-year-old white woman from Des Plaines to be reading a James Baldwin book. But my mom always was an open-minded person. And so the next time I went down, they were writing articles about my mother. At that time, they gave her name and her address in these articles. And I went down, during Christmas I was going down quite frequently to watch the trial. The marshals pulled me aside and told me, because of what I did, they were trying to prove that my mom and I had spoken with each other about the trial, and they were going to try to remove her from the jury. And of course she didn't know she knew something was happening, but she didn't know what. She knew how upset I was. I was crying all the time. I didn't know what to do. The marshals pulled me aside and told me, because of what I did, my mother was going to go to prison for 2 years and be held in contempt of court. And I mean, this was just, that they could even do anything, is just anything that cruel. My dad, of course, was ready to kill me. And I mean, this was right before Christmas. I was beside myself. My mother knew something was wrong, didn't know what. She had been talking to my dad on the phone, and he was telling her how upset I was. And so finally one day when I was down there, I got in the elevator, I was leaving, and the elevator door closed behind me, and Bill Kunstler and Abby Hoffman got in the elevator behind me, came up to me and put their arms around me and said, your mother is never going to prison. They can't take her off the jury. This is hearsay. They have no proof. You just calm down. We'll never let this happen. Well, I mean, it didn't happen. It finally didn't happen. But the point was, they wouldn't tell my mother what was going on. You know, we lived through holy hell for like 3 weeks because of this. And the way we were treated was just abominable. And so, of course, by that time, everybody knew that my mother was a sympathetic juror. She had been written up in the papers. Everybody knew who she was. And so she became kind of famous or infamous, I should say. Here, this is what they're talking about here. They're calling her a tainted juror. So after this incident happened and they were trying to remove my mom from the jury, they were writing her up in the newspapers. And it's just, you know, and it said, Kunstler charged the prosecution was about to launch an attack on the juror, Mrs. Jean Fritz. An attempt was going to be made to remove her from the jury. And then, on top of that, they gave our address and where she lived. I mean, something like that never should have happened. Actually, at the beginning of the trial, they printed all of the jurors' addresses. I mean, that would never be allowed now. But so, therefore, I mean, that was a really hard experience for us. And, you know, but then and then the prosecution was trying to deny that they were doing it. But they had to drop it eventually because it says here, Mrs. Fritz is regarded by the defendants as the juror most favorable to them. An articulate suburbanite with 2 college-age children. They have the time frame mixed up here, but she came to court this morning with reading a book by James Baldwin, but that was earlier. So, I mean, my mom became very famous in the trial, and so that made, like, the last month made it a lot more difficult, particularly with the 8 people that wanted them guilty on all counts. My mom even said in her journal several times that these 8, they thought they were guilty from day one, never changed their minds. She said there's no, you know, I don't know what we're going to do once we get into deliberation. So then this is the deliberation and the verdict, and my mom was actually really dreading going into deliberation because she really didn't know, you know, how she was going to be treated. By that time, the other 8, when I talked to people about this trial, I stressed to them how divided our country was at that time, just like it is now, between Trump and anti-Trump people, the pro-Vietnam War and the anti-war people, the Black Panthers. There was so much hatred in the country, it was unbelievable. They hated long hairs, they hated protesters, and these 8 that wanted them guilty on all counts were those kind of people. And she said several times, she said, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if we're going to fight. I don't know what to anticipate in the deliberation room. So they got into deliberation and they handed, Saturday, they went into deliberation on Valentine's Day. And the first vote was 8 jurors convict on all counts and 4 for acquit on all counts. Now, they handed in 2 hung jury notices to Judge Hoffman, and he refused them. And the marshal came and threatened them and said, we'll keep you here as long as it takes for you to reach a verdict. They also requested transcripts of the trial. Now, mind you, there's a 5-month trial. They were denied transcripts, which is, I mean, all of this was blatantly unconstitutional and illegal. And so, and actually the deliberation only lasted for like 4 to 5 days because, as my mom said, we were never going to reach an agreement. It was never going to happen. And in the deliberation room, the other 8 accused my mother of not having a mind of her own. She had a daughter that was a hippie in college, and she did, all she did was listen to her daughter. I mean, they were horribly cruel to her. My mom was, virtually crying in the deliberation room because they were so cruel and so despicable to her. And so eventually, what they decided on, they reached a split verdict. They found them innocent on the conspiracy charges and guilty on crossing state lines to incite a riot. Lee Weiner and John Fritz were found innocent of everything because they never should have been involved in the first place. So my mom one of the reasons she agreed to do that, she was afraid that if inevitably they were going to be forced to accept a hung jury, that she was worried that Nixon would retry them. And at that time, because he was so vehement about convicting these people, there's a strong possibility he might have. But the defendants were hoping for a hung jury. So as they reached this compromise verdict, my mom said she couldn't live with herself. She thought she had betrayed her own beliefs. At this point, she was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. And when she says right here, in the quest for truth, we, the four holdouts, Jean, Shirley, Mary, and Frida, feel it is time for us to speak. We convicted the defendants Hoffman, Davis, Dellinger, Rubin, and Hayden on the anti-riot law, not because we felt they were crossing state lines to incite a riot, but because we wanted the defendants not guilty on the conspiracy charge. We compromised within ourselves and with no one else. We felt the defendants were guilty in asking people to come to Chicago, and then when the trouble started, none of them were there to help take care of the people. But she said, as of now, we can see that we had no right to take the lives of these men in our hands, to find them guilty on a law that we firmly believe is unconstitutional. And when my mom came home, because everybody knew who she was at that time, there was media up and down the street. Everybody wanted to speak to her. She would speak to no one. She ran upstairs in her bedroom, she closed the door, and she just sobbed. She virtually almost had a nervous breakdown. It was really scary. Even that night, Walter Cronkite called her and wanted to talk to her, and she wouldn't even talk to Walter Cronkite. I said, Mom, just please, just talk to Walter Cronkite. She would not. As a result of the verdict, and because they had our address and they knew my mother's name, she got hate mail, she had death threats. Neighbors down the street that they'd been friends for 30 years stopped speaking to her. They accused her of being a communist. It was incredible. People came in my dad's store, said, we're not going to do business with you any longer because of what your wife did. It was, my mom and dad, were always kind of moderate politically. They always voted, but both of them, particularly my mother, she would vote Republican occasionally. And after that trial, she said, I'll never vote Republican again in my life, and became a lifelong liberal Democrat, as did my dad. So after the trial was over, she refused to give interviews to anyone. She just would not do that. And as did the other jurors as well. They did not give interviews. They spoke a little piecemeal to journalists as they were leaving the courtroom. They were sent home, but nobody gave interviews after that. But finally, the trial was over in February. It was in August of that year, 1970. John Schultz, who was a creative writing teacher at Columbia, also a journalist who covered the trial and wrote several books about the trial, approached my mom and Shirley, who was another woman that was one of them innocent on all counts, and Shirley Seehome, and asked them if they would give him an interview in Evergreen magazine, which was an underground magazine at the time. And they agreed to do that. So, and this was the article, like the last two people on the face of the earth. So they gave this interview to John Schultz, and as a result of that interview, because my mother told the exact truth, everything what happened in the deliberation room, that denied the hung jury notice, wouldn't give them transcripts, how the marshals threatened them, what was done during the trial, that they weren't given information, that she felt, that Hoffman was never an impartial judge, that he hated them from the beginning, and how unfair she thought he was, and told the whole truth about everything that happened during the 5 months they were sequestered. Well, as a result of that, in November, they convened 2 special hearings, and they called in all of the jurors, Hoffman and the marshals, and they were questioned about what took place. And when they questioned the jurors, my mom, most of them said, I don't remember, and wouldn't answer questions. But my mother got on the stand and said exactly the same thing she had said in the article, talked about what happened during the entire trial and the unconstitutionality, the illegality of the trial. And as a result of that, as a result of her interview, and as a result of what she said in the special hearings, and Shirley to a certain extent as well, but my mom was much more vocal, the criminal charges were overturned. So, I mean, it kind of brings you around to the thought that if you stick up for what you believe in and you tell the truth, I mean, one person can change the course of events. And it's, you know, even though she thought it was, that, you know, that mixed verdict was wrong and she had a hard time living with herself by it, actually it turned out in retrospect to probably the best thing they could have done. And so, I mean, as a result of that, also Studs Terkel also covered the trial. He was there frequently, and he was there for the special hearings, and he wrote her a personal letter, which is over there in the other display case, thanking her for her bravery. And I mean, to me, that's one of the most wonderful things that ever could have happened, getting a letter from Studs Terkel. So therefore, this is, you know, I mean, it just, this to me is like her insight, her understanding, and her compassion for somebody that was thrown into a situation just out of nowhere, was, as I read the journal a couple of years ago, I hadn't read it in a very long time, and Mom was not doing well mentally, and she was 99 years old, and she died right before her 100th birthday, so never saw this exhibit. But to me, it was just to remind me of what she was, because it was very difficult of what we were going through at the time. And when I was younger, I didn't think this was any big deal. Looking at it through an older person's eyes, I realized what a big deal it was, and what she did, what a big deal it was, and how proud of her I am.